Well, hello and welcome, or welcome back, to That Girl's Quilting Threads and Things. This is a channel where I try to share with you, the viewer, tips and tricks on things that I have learned along the way in my quilting journeys. Today's project is a special project for a very dear friend of ours. Every Monday night, a group of us get together and we play lots and lots of fun board games. So this quilt project is for Tony, who always plays yellow. This project is a great scrap buster. It can also be a stash buster. I was able to utilize quite a bit of my scraps in a bin that you'll see in a moment how big that bin is. But I was also able to utilize a bunch of fat quarters that I didn't seem to have a project for. So come and join me at the cutting table and let's see how we build Tony's quilt, Asterisks around the table. So to get this project started, I had an actual task that I needed to complete in order for me to be confident that I had what I needed. So all of the blocks basically are all scraps that came from here. So I had to separate everything by the basic colors, right? So we have greens, purples, reds, yellows. I even had browns and creams and blacks and grays. There's a lot of scraps in here. This project is really a great scrap buster. The first one I'm going to start out with is I cut some batting. And that batting is about 9 to 9.5 inches square. So I've got plenty of overlap space. My squares are going to finish out 8.5 inches before they get put into the quilt project itself. Also, I took some fat quarters that I wasn't going to use for any particular project, and I just cut them in fours. So I'm going to put a few of these strips together to make the process a little bit easier for me. And I'm just going to chain piece these. Now all I have to do is just cut these strips up, finger press them open, and then I'll have strips that I can work with, whether they're short or long. All right, so we'll just do these, just a simple, easy finger press open. The only rule is here, there are no rules. All right, so now I'm going to separate these into kind of colors of bright, light, and darkness. So now that we have our colors separated, then I can go ahead and start attaching them to the project. Get the back piece. Go ahead and line up. I like to line mine up pretty close to the edges. Just makes it easier for me when I'm trimming everything down. Choose a center piece. All right, go ahead and start attaching pieces. So I'll just grab a piece of fabric or fabric pieces that I put together, and I'll make sure that it's either the same length or a little bit longer. And then I'll just cut a piece off of that. For the smaller pieces, I can use this. It's quite easy. All right. And my scrap pieces are not the same size. And they are also not all straight. Sometimes I'll lay them a little bit crooked to give it a little bit of a wonky look and feel. And I will go ahead and cut another strip out of this for use on another block or on another side. And line it up and attach it. I have been using a 1/4 inch seam allowance on this. All right, and once you've done that, just roll it open. Give it a good finger press that lays it as flat as possible. I like to, if it overlaps too much, I do like to kind of trim it off just to help eliminate bulk. That's the first piece. Let's see if we've got a second piece that will match. Oh, that one's too short. That one's too short. Let's see if we've got a longer one. Okay, so we do. We have this. So I'll just go ahead and cut me a piece. Set these off to the side. All right, cut that tail end off, and I'll just fold it back on itself so that it has a fairly straight edge. Throw this piece over in the scrap pile. And we'll go for another one, maybe one that has a little bit more darkness to it. This might work. And I will just go that way. So I cut off the selvage edge. And you just keep going around and around the outside until you get to your edges. So maybe I will do one of these. Okay, so I'll start there. Now that I have this all done, there's only a little bit showing here, but that's why I cut them at 9 inches as a 9.5 inches. So I have a little bit of wiggle room to cut. So what I'll do is I'll just double check to see where the edge of this is, making sure that my 8.5 inch square ruler is all on batting. So then all I do now is just simply cut around the ruler. Basically what I'm looking for with each cut is I'm looking to make sure that I have a little bit of backing in each cut. That way I know that I have batting underneath every piece of fabric. And we're ready to start the next block. So I've got my stuff set up. Again, lights in one pile. That'll work. Right sides together. And we'll just keep repeating the same process around and round. All right, now we're ready to cut this one. And there's our wonky block. Now what I did notice is that with the Quilt-As-You-Go, and when you're using the automatic thread cutter, you have to cut off all of your thread tails. Now that I've got them all together, I've pressed them nice and firm, and I'm going to lose about 1/4 inch visibility of the whole block, and I did expect that. So to put these together, these blocks are stitched to the edge in most cases, which is perfectly fine. What I did is I am simply butting these blocks together. So I have sashing pieces or joining strips, however you might call them. I have them cut for my front side and my back side. All right, and again, this is all quilter's choice. You can make it scrappy. You can use leftover scraps, just cut them however you choose. I'll take my blocks, I'll lay them side by side, and this is how it's going to be butted up. All right. To do this process, I've cut joining strips at 1.5 inches for the front and 1.5 inches for the back. And I played around with this to see how it would work if I should pre-press them in so that they are folded in halfway and folded in halfway like that. And I found that very, very, very fiddly. So what I did was, I'm taking one block and I'll take a joining strip for my back side, and I'm going to align it up right side down, right on the edge of the block, just like that. Then I'm going to grab it and I'm going to flip it over so that the right side of the block is facing up, and I'm going to take a front facing joining strip, laying it right sides face down, and just like that. And I'll even pin it in place or clip it in place using these little clips. I found that clips in this case worked much easier than pinning, but you only need a couple. If your blocks are small enough, you only need a couple, just enough to keep it, both of those strips in place. So just like that on both sides. All right, and then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to sew 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way down the right side. So I'll put my sashing strips right there. The other thing that I'm doing here is I'm keeping basically the two blocks that I want to put together, I'm keeping them side by side. So I have my blocks arranged in a specific way. So I want to make sure that I keep that arrangement. All right, and I, again, just a 1/4 inch seam allowance. All right, so what you have here now is you have your front facing and you have your back facing joining strips. And you have a nice 1/4 inch seam allowance right here. Okay, and so I just give this a nice finger press. Just like that on both sides. And then what I'll do is I'll go right down the same side with these, and I'll go 1/8 of an inch on this edge. This will just help keep that joining strip nice and flat. All right, so there we have part of it already done. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over to the pressing station, and I am just going to press both of these joining strips. I'm going to fold them, and I'm going to press it so that the edge, the raw edge of that strip is right up against the 1/4 inch, the raw edge of the 1/4 inch seam allowance. I will do that for both of these strips. So I'll be right back. Okay, so now I've pressed this, and I'll just open this up a little bit so you can see it a little better. So now I have my two seams pressed inward, and that's about a little bit more than just a 1/4 of an inch. And they're right up next to this raw edge. So if I open it and lay it flat, you'll see that that is right up against the raw edge of the quilt block, and the same with this side. It is right up against it. Now I'm ready to attach the other block to it. So here, all I have to do is put this together, match it up, so the other thing that I noticed is that when you're doing this, because you're starting out with some bulk, it's always good to have a small starter piece to help keep your presser foot level. All right, so let's go ahead and pin this together. So a couple of things you want to make sure that you're doing is you want to make sure when you do put your rows together that you line them up nice and flush, making sure that your bottom joining strip or your joining strip on the back side is not getting folded up into this area here, since you're dealing with a longer piece. The other thing that you want to do is you want to make sure that your opposing joining strips are also lined up. So this takes a little bit of fiddling around. So I want to make sure that that's lying nice and flat so that I can rest that unit on it. Now for the longer strips, what I find is if I start, I do one on each end, and then I do one in the middle, and then I just kind of incrementally make sure everything is lined up and add in those additional pins. And you may have a different method for this. It's whatever works better for you, how you're used to managing your quilt pieces. Okay, so pinning this in the longer units, I like using the little curved basting pins. I just gave it a try, and they work so much easier with that bend in it to help cradle up instead of ruining the straight pins. All right, let's do one quick check on the back side to make sure everything is nice and smooth. So the stripping is attached to this row here. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to start at the other end, and I'm going to make my first pass on this side, so 1/8 inch from the edge of the joining strip, and then come back around and do my 1/8 inch on this side. All right, so I'm going to pivot around, cross over, and come back down the other side. So looking at, just going to double check both sides to see if I skipped or missed anything. And voila! Rows 1 and 2 of the center portion of the quilt are done. And that's all that you have to do. Now, when you're putting the other pieces together, right, so it's going to be the same process. So these are my center rows here. Once I get these put together, I have side rows that I will attach going lengthwise, but following the same exact process. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and finish attaching all of my rows together. It might take me a stitch or two, but I'll see you in a jiffy. Okay, I've got all of the blocks and rows put together. Okay, I'm machine attaching my binding. I do this on the front and the back side. I start out on the back side, and I cut myself a nice little angle, if you will, maybe 45 degrees. What this does is when I finished attaching the binding on the back side, I can simply tuck the tail in, close it over, and then I can fold it over, and that makes it really nice and easy. I also manage my binding, and I'll just take box lids and I'll cut 5 by 10 or 5 by 11 pieces out of it. But I also use it to wrap my yardage in. Cardboard boxes from shipping makes it free, and free is for me. If this is the start of the binding strip and I have this flap open, I'm starting about 4, maybe 6 inches down from the top of the crease down to here, just to give me some room to have that open when it does come time to tuck that in. So my seam allowance is going to be 3/8. It leaves me plenty of room to have a good seam allowance for the thicker fabrics, but it also has enough room to accommodate when you wrap your binding over to the front side. There is about 1/8 of an inch that gets consumed by the thickness of the fabric itself. So you just want to make sure that however wide you cut your binding, you just want to make sure that you have accounted for all of the real estate that is needed for the binding to fold back on itself and over to the front side. So I'm just making sure that my binding is nice and flat, and that I have a way to maneuver the quilt easily. The gloves help me grip the quilt just a little bit easier because the quilt is quite heavy compared to patchwork and piecing activities. Once the batting and backing is added, there's a considerable amount of weight added to it. All right, so here we go. So now I'm at my first corner right here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to fold this fabric at a perpendicular line so that it forms a angle, and that angle goes right in line with the corner. Pin it, and I'm going to put the pin in right in line with the seam allowance just to kind of help me keep it in place and mark it where I want to go. And then I'm going to fold this back on itself. The fold is right in line with the raw edge of the quilt, and I'm just going to lay it there. I'm not going to do anything else, just lay it there. Now I'm going to take my pin out to help me keep it in place. I'm going to pin it again, keeping it right in line with the original stitching line. So, and it's more of a visual reference as much as it is a temporary hold solution. Now I'm ready to go ahead and pivot the quilt, and I'm going to pick up the sewing on this side of the pin, keeping the 3/8 inch seam allowance, and then we'll continue our binding just as we did on this side. Okay, so I'm coming up on the end of the binding, and I've cut it off so that it overlaps a little bit. Give yourself a couple of inches, and I took that raw edge that I had and I gave myself just kind of a finger press seam allowance. All this is going to do is this is going to go ahead and keep your raw edges from being exposed. It's laying this way. All I have to do now is just simply tuck that in. Make sure it's laying nice and flat, and then just to keep it in place, I'm going to go ahead and pin it here, and now I can go ahead and finish attaching the back side. So now I'm going to go through, and I'm going to actually press the binding outward so that it gives it a nice firm hold on it, and I'll wrap it around the other side. I'll probably clip it in place. Pressed, clipped, and ready to go. So I have a foot here, if you can see, that's got a little ridge on it. And that little ridge is enough to kind of help keep the presser foot balanced so that when the foot is traveling along and you have an extra thickness of fabric here, this beveled edge here kind of acts as a guide to keep that foot level. Now, if that's the proper official use for this foot, I don't know. a quilting friend gave me this information and I was like, oh my gosh, yes, that's so helpful. I will probably be taking and just doing a 1/8 inch away or 1/16 inch away from the edge of the binding. If I stitch anything over 1/8 of an inch, then I get this like little lip, and I want to kind of avoid that. I would like it to be as flat as possible. Once I get the binding all attached to the front, we'll come back for the full reveal. I really had a fun time working with the wonky log cabin style for the border, and also playing around with the non-traditional shapes for the inner blocks. I hope that you enjoyed this journey, and I'd like to thank you very, very much for watching. And until that next quilting journey, may all your quilting journeys be joyful, one stitch at a time. No, that's just... I use Quilt-As-You-Go, so this back to that. Well, hello? Okay. All right. Now I don't know what to say.